I actually am so excited to talk about imaginary space, and it's funny hearing that quote from Kate Hepburn. One of my mentors was André Serban, who's a theater and opera director. He was my teacher in grad school, and I remember once being in a class with him, and he said, you have to realize the whole theater happens in the audience's head. And it was sort of this moment of kind of distress, for us as artists, because you do everything you can to make an event, and you're pouring your heart and your soul into every detail. But, he was sort of saying, well, there it is. Actually, the event occurs in the audience's minds. So I don't think I quite understood it as a student. I sort of heard that, and I thought, what is he talking about, really? But I often go back to that and think about that. I had another great teacher by the name of Paul Sills. He founded the Second City in Chicago. His mother was Viola Spolin, and she wrote a seminal book called Improvisation for the Theater. She was teaching theater games to children in Chicago at the time of the Hull House. And she would create games to release children. It was all about getting out of one's head and one's self of judgment of what is right and wrong, and getting into that space of play and the unknown. And Paul was her son, and he grew up playing theater games, sort of that's what they did for entertainment around the house, and that was his life. And then he turned them into a form of entertainment in Chicago, and he was working with Elaine May and Mike Nichols, and they developed a whole form of comedy improvisational comedy based on these games. And Paul was so important to me. He passed away in this last year, but he used to always talk about space and the art of improvisation, and that has been very important to me as an artist and a director, and in my work with actors, is the idea that there is a potential in the invisible, and that we are trying to make the invisible visible. So I just reflected on those based on the topic of tonight's conversation. And I think always in the theater, as a director, one's job is to sense some kind of potential, that's what we're looking for. We have the nose for the potential in something, and our job is to lead the troops, up the mountain, and keep everybody marching up the mountain, even when you're tired and you're hungry and you feel like you can't go any further, with that idea of the potential, which is something that is potent, that is to be released, to be uncovered. And so much of that is, for me, about the imagination and the unknown. And usually when I start rehearsals as a director, I say to my cast, the way I'd like to work is, you'll come into the process with an idea, and I'm going to give you an idea, and together, between the two of us, we're going to make a third idea that's better than either of ideas. And I sort of say that right up front. But this idea of that unknown, which is what, I think I'm addicted to in the theater, and why, I love it and I do it, and you work crazy hours and, pour your soul into it, because there is this potential of something great, and that's why we are at it. And I love the theater because it's about community. And I guess the last piece of the community is really the audience, to return to this question of the audience. What is theater? And I think that's a question that we ask ourselves a lot right now, especially those of us who produce and are working in the field. What is the viability of our form? Will we have a secure future as we move into the 21st century? And I don't know if anyone saw that article in the Times today. It was not in the arts section, but it was about how Twitter is driving more television viewership. Did anyone read that today? But I was reading that, I thought, that's interesting. But what it was really talking about is the Olympics, the current Vancouver Olympics, are the highest watched Olympics. They're breaking all records. And this past Super Bowl, my God, I'm not such a good sports person, the Saints that won in New Orleans, was the highest ever attendance in the history of U.S. television. It was the largest viewership. It beat that episode of MASH that they always say was the high. And what they're attributing it to is the Twitter community, because people want to be connected and talking about a live event. And that just really fascinated me because I thought, what is this thing about community, about wanting to share something and talk about it? Because that's what they said. The purpose of the television is you have one common thing that you're all experiencing that then you want to talk about. So as I've come to the ART now, and I have to say, I was born and bred in New York City, but I did go to Harvard. It's the one other place I've ever lived is in Cambridge for 4 years. That was in the 80s. So I do feel this is a homecoming for me. And my interest deeply is in this question, which is actually at the core of our mission. The mission of the ART is to expand the boundaries of theater through exploration of new work and work from the canon. And that mission has led me to this question that I mentioned earlier: what is theater? What is the definition of theater? What is the event of theater? And for me, more than ever, the idea of audience is central to that. And I think more than ever because as a medium, that's what we have. The theater is no question in my mind about a transference of energy between a performer and an audience that is live, that is in real time, that can only be experienced right now, right here in this moment. And if our form is to remain viable and powerful, we have to embrace, and that's my interest, the most palpable aspect of that. And when I mean palpable, I mean there can be wonderful theater where the audience actually, if they're there or not there, doesn't really matter. And that's not to say that's not valid theater. Certainly in the turn of the century, when the whole form of realism was starting, that was a radical revolutionary move in the theater, that the audience was invisible, and it was as if they didn't exist, and the notion of the fourth wall came into play, and we were voyeurs, sort of peering through a peephole, and life was happening on stage as if we weren't there. And that was also happening along with the movement of putting the audience in the dark. Wagner was a person in the artistic circle who wanted the house lights turned out. He was the one who propagated that idea. He wanted total, utter concentration on the stage. 19th century opera before that was very much about a social scene and getting dressed and coming to the opera and flirting with the people in the boxes in between the arias, and that's what it meant to go to the opera. He had no tolerance for that. He wanted everyone in the dark, so everybody was focused on the stage. So these were radical concepts that we've inherited now, and of course, they've been inherited even further through other mediums. If one thinks about film being the ultimate kind of immersion in a naturalistic, lifelike storytelling. Again, not necessarily, because we've all seen films that break those rules. But for me in the theater, I'm interested in making the audience have an active presence again. So I guess I think of it a little bit more expanded than just imagination, because I think your imagination can be engaged in many different ways. You can absolutely be quiet sitting in an audience seat and just watching a play as if you're not there, and your mind can be wildly engaged. I'm sort of interested in a further idea, which is to let the audience feel like they are a participant and they have a role in the event. And I'll just talk for a minute about a sports analogy, even though I said I'm not a sports person. I do think about sports all the time, and maybe this will make my point a little clearer. We have the theater, and there are many different kinds of theaters, what I was saying before. I think there's a whole spectrum of theater. Just as in sports, there are many kinds of sports. And it kind of makes me crazy because we say, oh, I do theater. But really, one would never go around and say, well, I do sports. You'd say, I play golf, or I'm a professional basketball player. And if you look at that range of sports, you have tennis or golf on one end of the spectrum, where the etiquette for the spectator is very clear. You have to get quiet. The serve goes. It's all about concentration. You don't want to disturb anybody's move. Very silent. The serve is made. That's the etiquette. And then if you go down the graph to a basketball game, there you are, a spectator at the game, and you're behind the basketball, and the guy goes to make a foul shot, and you better have your foam finger waving it like crazy, trying to do everything you can to distract the player. And that's what it means to actually go to a live basketball game versus watch it on your television. You could actually participate. So I always think sometimes in the theater we tend to lump it all in one category, and I am interested in releasing an audience and kind of opening up the rules of etiquette in the theater. I think it's very hard for audience to feel like they could have a different kind of behavior. I, for one, know when I went to the Globe Theatre in London, I don't know if anyone's been there, they have a replica of the Globe Theatre. And I went to London, I thought, this is my chance. I'm going to be a ground lead. I can't believe it. All my fantasies of Elizabethan England and standing on the pit and, shouting at the performers. And I went to see Mark Rylance in Hamlet. Brilliant performance. We get to the to be or not to be speech, and this helicopter flies over. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And it's obliterating, I think, about 3/4 of the most famous speech in that play. And I was watching, standing in the pit, and my heart started racing, and I thought, okay, say something, just say it. Tell him to repeat it, scream out loud, say again, do something. And, my heart raced more and more, and then I just couldn't do it. I looked at the floor, and I was like shuffling, and I thought, I can't call out like that. I'll be asked to leave. This is behavior that's not proper for the theater. And there I was in that architecture. Every other signal was given to me that I should be allowed to do that. So what was that? My theatrical superego, etiquette superego that said, no, you can't behave that way. So I guess I get interested in opening up the definitions of what is theater. Where is theater? Does it have to be in a relationship where you're sitting in a chair? Does it have to be that the chair is bolted to the floor? If we look historically at theater, theater is ritual. Theater was done in all different kinds of architecture. Outside town squares, on pageant wagons, inside churches, on top of hills. Theater took place over several days in festivals. The duration of theater, the location of theater, the participation, all these elements of the theater interest me. And I have to say, it's not about inventing something new. It's really about actually looking historically at the roots of theater and not feeling caught in perhaps a narrow definition of what we've inherited as the rules of theater. And that's what interests me. And I think the idea of imagination and space and releasing an audience is central to that. So I think maybe I'll leave with that as my opening remarks and look forward to engage in lots of dialogue about what all that can mean for us. Thank you.
Okay, so Maeve, if you'd like to speak now, and then we can, I'd like to ask you a few questions, and then we'll open up to the audience.
Thank you, Diane. It's very interesting for me to hear. We're going from the macro to the micro, to the actors, some thoughts from an actor's point of view. When I heard the title and heard the word space, I remembered the first time I ever went into a theater when it was dark. And it was the most inert, most dead space. And I was so surprised because it had been a place that I'd worked in and associated with life and vitality. So I thought I would talk a little bit about the way an actor relates to the various aspects of his craft, and space and distance, relationship, connection. Space in the theater is made real and alive by what it surrounds: a table, a chair, an actor. Theatrical space is organized by these material presences and also by light and sound. Nothing is more real than the actor on the stage. An actor always preserves and uses space between himself and the audience, between himself and other actors, between himself and the material, whether it's a poem, a play, a song. An actor is always aware of distance and intimacy, or to say it another way, an actor is always aware of connections or lack of connections. There's a wonderful story about Vanessa Redgrave. It's probably apocryphal, probably shouldn't be repeated, but I love it very much, so I'm going to tell it. Which is that one day she looked in the mirror and thought to herself it was time for a little plastic surgery. But what she did was only to have her eyelids lifted, because when she looked in the mirror, she thought the audience would not be able to see her eyes, and that they would lose her, and that she would lose them. So that's part and parcel of what I want to talk about. The phrase "to take stage," which is common, to me could also mean to take space, to take up space. Because one of the things an actor has to be able to do, to be willing to do, to know how to do, is to pull focus, to make the space around him and that connects him to the other actors real. There's a wonderful beginning actor's exercise, which is very simple and very compelling. And some people who can do it feel the call, and some people I've seen not be able to do it, which is that there'll be a class, maybe about the size of this. Somebody will come up front, the actor, and just stand there. Say nothing. And for the period of maybe 3 or 4 minutes, the class will look at the actor, have complete impunity to look anywhere, see anything, observe anything. The actor can participate in the gaze if the person wants, can look at the other person, or look at the back. But the point is, the actor lives in 2 places at once. The actor has something going on inside which has to be inviolable. At the same time, the actor has to share what's coming at them, interest, whatever is sensed from the audience. And in this way, the space becomes alive. You can feel it when you're on stage. There's a current that's there, or not there, which is not so good. Okay, lost in space. This is something that I think about when an actor goes on stage before they've really found the thing inside, before they've really completed their task, which is to either know exactly what their task is in theater or a multimedia event, or to find the reality of their character. If they have that, if that's really internalized, the actor is safe and inviolable no matter how close they get to the audience, no matter how far away they get from the audience, no matter how close they get to the other actor, no matter how far removed they get from the material they're working with. And I remember once a terrible, terrible thing to happen that was so frightening. It really was as though I was lost in space. It was at the Loeb, and we were doing years ago Coriolanus, and Tommy Lee Jones was Coriolanus, and he was unbelievably wonderful. The best I've ever seen. Not that that many people do Coriolanus, but I was playing his loving wife, and I was high up on a rampart, and I was looking down at him in character, devotedly as Virgilia, and because I had a slight crush on him, as everybody did, my thoughts kind of segued into, I don't know what, realizing that he could jump and leap, and he was extraordinarily something or other. And then there was a vast silence on stage. And through the mists of time, I realized that the last thing I'd heard was my cue. And I have no idea. I couldn't possibly tell you whether it was half a minute, 3 minutes. All I know is I felt I was having to come back to Earth from Mars, and it was truly, truly terrifying. Okay, these are some opening remarks, and then I want to quickly go to, I guess I should make the caveat that all of these things that I've talked about vary enormously according to genre and medium. For instance, I've done wonderful poetry readings with theater actors. And in that instance, I think the connection between the actor is strongest to the text. In other words, I think that there's a value when the actor is reading the poem for the audience to sense this deep engagement of the actor with the words. It's almost as though the audience is seeing a private moment or hearing the text inside the audience's head. And I want to talk for a minute, I've probably lost track of time, about soaps, which is a form which I think is dying, it's probably going to have a resurgence because it's basically narrative. That's what it is, and it's related to the oldest form of storytelling. But in this particular form, the connections are very strange and very lopsided. To begin with, a small point is that in the theater, one of the things that an actor uses to remain inside what they're doing and also to relate to the audience is, of course, things like props. The relationship to the set is very important. Those things are not really important to soap opera actors because there's just no time. And it's a great shame and a great pity. But you report to work at 7 o'clock in the morning, you have 1 or 2 rehearsals if you're lucky, and you go. So it's basically like improv. So when you get on the set, you can't make a meaningful relationship. The way Masha has to put her hat on and then take it off when Vershinin comes in. That's a very important moment for the actor, and you have to know exactly what you mean exactly when you take your hat pin out. None of that happens for a soap opera actor. There's another reason, which is that all of that work is done by the camera, and the soap opera actor knows it. So you don't have time, and you can't worry about it. But it's in a way a lack of richness. Okay, so the soap opera actor also does not have an audience. Your audience is your camera, and you have to relate to that, but you can't be caught relating to it because there is the fourth wall that's observed. If you're caught relating to the lens, then you've made a big mistake, and everybody out there knows it. So what do you connect to? There are two things you connect to very, very strongly, and again, it's sort of a topsy-turvy kind of medium. You connect to the emotion of the moment. And the emotion, you have to, by hook or by crook, believe in the emotion that your character is experiencing. And those emotions are very big. They're very unnuanced. They're very unsurprising. They're very old as the hills. They're very grand guignol. The audience finds them very reassuring because they are predictable, but because of the intensity of them, they are involving and interesting. The other thing that the soap opera actor has to connect to is her acting partner. Because you stand, particularly in the old days, in the 80s, the dialogue was often written in one-liners. You would get 30 pages of dialogue. You have to memorize it. You have to be ready to go. You stand there face to face, and you see your person you're acting with very, very close. There's not much physical distance. But underneath these big, brawling, cliched lines, you feel what's going on in the other person. And what makes it interesting is the subtext, the eccentricities of the other person. That's what you pick up and you play with. So those two things are very specific about soaps. And the other thing that's strange about it is that although it's a very distant medium, it's also very intimate. You go into people's houses. You arrive there via the television set in their living room. And when you meet them on the street, you are... The audience believes they know you, but what they believe they know is the character, not the actor. So I've had people be followed into the bathrooms. There was actually a woman who was in the stall, and people were knocking on the stall. I went once, my mother was very ill, and she was in the ICU, and I went into the hospital and got to the nurses' station, and a few nurses said, "Vanessa!" Well, the point that I'm trying to make is that there is this sense of intimacy, but the actor knows that it's bogus because the person that they're relating to is the fictional character. It's not the actor. Whereas in theater, the audience has, particularly if they're sophisticated and love the theater, the audience member will go to see Ian McKellen. They'll go to see Christopher Plummer. they follow the career. The relationship is with the artistry and the artist, not with the character. So those are just a few sort of riffs on distance, intimacy, stuff like that. Thanks.
So, Diane, I was wondering, if you take down the fourth wall and there's enough interaction, when does it stop being theater and become happening? And so, for instance, I was thinking about Woodstock. So it became, first it was a performance, musicians performing, then the audience joined in, and then the boundaries between the audience and the performers got looser and looser. And then I think somebody filmed it, because I know I saw a film of Woodstock. So it became a performance to be watched again. But at all points, did you feel it was theater, interactive theater?
I think happenings are theater, actually. And again, I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about what we call theater, what we think theater. I mean, if I say, what's theater? I think most people think, oh yeah, theater, I go to a building and I stand in a lobby for a while, and I get my ticket, and then they open the house and I go in and I get a program and I sit in a chair in a line and I wait for a while and the house lights go down and I see a show and I'm moved, I laugh, I cry, I'm bored, I fall asleep, any of the above, and then it's over, I go home. And that's what we think theater is. But I'm so on a mission to really break that limitation. I mean, in our contemporary society, I look at things like rock concerts. I'm very interested in ancient Greek civilization, and I'm very interested in my fantasies of what 5th century Athens was like, when theater was ritual and festival and civic and religious and the birth of democracy all rolled into one, and Sophocles and Aeschylus are on the streets giving the argument of their play a week in advance to kind of campaign for their play, because one of them is going to win the prize on Saturday and you better come and watch and vote. And when Medea's done, nobody goes home after a woman's killed her children. There's a satyr play, so you dance and you have fun, and there are people running around with all kinds of crazy things to kind of relieve the mind. I mean, that was all theater. So I think that's what I loop back to rock concerts. When I look at rock concerts, I sometimes think, wow, 100 years from now, people are going to look back at the 20th century and say, that ritual theater of the rock star. I mean, if you look at that and you look at what's going on, and I mean, that's music. One could say there's not a lot of story there. I know this is going to be blasphemous, but I look at professional wrestling. I'm not really a professional wrestling fan, but I do look at it and I think, my gosh, what is more theater than that? These are characters. They're completely in choreographed fights. I mean, it's completely, it's a willing disbelief, what you were saying about the dual things. An audience goes to a WWF event, they're not really hitting each other, and they're, bang, landing a foot away, and everyone's oohing and eyeing and screaming. It's like this absolute theatrical investment in these characters, and they have stories and they have leitmotifs and music when they enter the arena, and I think that's theater. Mm-hmm. So I think when I think about happenings or ritual, certainly I've been very interested in 1960s. I mean, if we want to come a little closer, which was when the happenings really happened, to our own time. And I actually did my thesis when I was at Harvard as an undergrad on the Living Theater, which was Julian Beck and Judith Malina. And one of their most famous works, Paradise Now, was kind of a ritual event. And by the end of it, it was done in, the structure was like 9 rungs, and they would burn money. And then there was the one where everyone took their clothes off. And then, by the end, they're leaving the theater and taking the pacifist anarchist revolution into the streets. And that's how the theater show ended. Mm-hmm. Very much about completely smashing the barrier of audience and spectator.
Okay. So Maeve and I have spoken about this, but I was curious for both of you to comment on whether really there need to be costumes, props, and sets. And I was thinking of the 1964 Hamlet production with Richard Burton, done in dress rehearsal clothing. And just as a aside that might be of interest, and I told Maeve this before, Richard Burton had trouble finding his interpretation of Hamlet, even helped by the director, who was John Gielgud. And so they stepped Gielgud aside, or he stepped aside, and Richard Burton's stepfather, Philip Burton, came in, and with the entry of Richard Burton's stepfather, Richard Burton could find his Hamlet. So as a psychiatrist, I find that very interesting. But anyway, I told the story about Richard Burton because he could do Hamlet with street clothes, and it was very effective. And so I was wondering if you ever do need props or settings. Now in Sleep No More, every room had props and settings. And I must say, when I got astray from the rest of the audience and ended up in a room by myself, the forest, that's when I think that's when the space came to life for me, because my imagination, I was alone, it was kind of dark, it was kind of creepy, and I really began to feel what Macbeth might have felt, like death could happen here. I think it was on the 3rd floor, wherever I was, and there were monitors at both ends, but I thought, well, what if they don't find me? Right. But it was not an actor who did that, it was the set. Right. So I kind of reversed my thinking about whether sets and props are important, but I'd like to hear from each of you.
Well, I actually, again, think it's, there's a spectrum, and they can be used in different ways. Actually, since I mentioned Paul Sills, when I was in acting school, I was studying with Paul Sills and Mike Nichols, the film director, at the same time, and we would bring scenes in. So, you'd pick a scene, from a contemporary work, a David Mamet play or Chekhov, and it would be up to you as the actors in the scene to create your own scene stuff, your design of the living room and what you imagine. Everybody would bring shopping bags. It was like the classic acting student thing. You're bringing shopping bags of dishes and hats and props, and we decorate and make, so you could immerse yourself into kind of a world. And every now and then Paul Sills would come and watch the scene study, and he just couldn't stand all that stuff. He would say, take it all away. His whole feeling was, you can litter a stage with things, but are you really in relation to them? And it was something you said about relationship and what is the core of theater, this current, another word you use, this current between two actors, and then between those two actors and the triangle to the audience, that energy. And then I would say, from the actor and the audience to the space. So you can have nothing on stage and there's no space. You can have absolute detail of every naturalistic, beautiful Tony Walton set, every detail, and it can also be dead. It's I think, what is the relationship? What is the connection? What is the purpose? Are these things vibrating and alive and necessary in a way? So for me, I tend not to think about, I like theater. I mean, personally, aesthetically, I always vote for less is more, even though there I was bringing Sleep No More, which could be nothing more than more in 44 rooms of, absolute detail. But I agree that those things are there. Sleep No More was such a great example of stuff that was vibrating. Even without an actor, it was vibrating, So I think it's not about what's right, and more how you're using things and if they have a sense of being alive.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I can also tell you from an actor's point of view that it sometimes a director, to my mind, not very skillful or in touch, will say, on that line, you go over there and you pick up the glass. And that's just death, because there's no relationship. You're just carrying out an order. If your character goes over there and picks up a glass and knows why and how, and the glass means something, the glass came from your aunt or uncle, that's totally different. I also agree with Diane that there's no rights or wrongs, except for certain kinds of genres that where you have to have props, where props are very important. It's true in Chekhov. It's true in the naturalistic plays. And there the actor's task is just exactly what she was talking about, to make that thing come alive because of what you're feeling and because of what you need to do. And there's a wonderful story I hope is related to this. It was in my experience when I was very young in New York and didn't know too much about anything, but they were doing a version of Tennessee Williams' Vieux Carré, and they had the auditions on stage in another, where the set was up from another play. And I went on, they said, go on the stage, nobody's in the house, the directors aren't there yet, but you can just walk around and get used to it, because there was a lot of stuff on the stage. So I was going to be doing a monologue for another play. It's a good thing to know where the bed is and the chair and not trip over everything. But what happened was I got out on the stage, the work lights were up, and it was a fascinating set. And I'd been told nobody was in the house was dark, so I went around and I looked at a lot of stuff. And also because I was an actor, I was trying to use what I was touching and looking at to calm myself, to center myself, to have a thought about it, to do my acting craft. And all of a sudden I hear somebody say, you can start now. And I went like this. They were out there watching, and they'd been watching silently, again, I don't know how long. I said, I'm so sorry. They said, it was fascinating. And it probably was, because it's, again, that relationship, the actor bringing the focus to the thing. The thing becomes alive if the actor has a reason to go see it. So that's kind of a long riff, but it's, it doesn't mean that you can't do a wonderful anything, as long as the script doesn't call for it, with minimal stuff. I mean, I want to see what you did with Midsummer Night's Dream, because I've heard wonderful things about it. And the other wonderful thing that I remember was Peter Brook's production, which was minimal. But
This one's not so minimal.
yeah,
This is like disco indulgence, but no. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's.
I do think, though, on this thing of the audience, what I do love about a minimal approach is, and we think about this to speak about Peter Brook. I think it was Peter Brook. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I think so. At one of the last one, I think it was his Carmen. He has a version of Carmen, and there was an action where the actor has a dagger, and he's going to kill someone. So the action is to stab the fellow actor on stage. So what he did was, the action starts, and right as it's about to go down, the lights went out. Because the idea is for the audience to be engaged in that, and then the lights cut, it goes in your mind. And what your mind can create of that act is probably more than we can create on the stage, So I get interested in that, is like, what can you do that's less? And in that case, it's always because if you really stab someone on stage, you're not really killing them. There's that level of theater that we're involved in. If you're really talking about theater, we're not in...
Alfred Hitchcock in one of his earlier movies had somebody murdered in a bed where there were curtains, and you see the curtains flapping because there's action behind the curtains, right, where a murder is occurring.
That's right.
But you don't see any of the murder, and then the curtains just stop,
right, and
it's happened. Yeah. But it's all in your head. It's all in your mind.
So that idea of engaging the audience imagination that way to fill in the detail and that is really very powerful. And sometimes when things are overly executed, I just remember I got very interested in all those shows that were happening in Las Vegas. So I was in Las Vegas for some reason. And I went to all of them because I thought, this is the cutting edge. Even Robert Lepage is doing shows in Las Vegas. I remember going to see some show, might have even been Siegfried and it's like tigers. I mean, it couldn't be more sort of exciting with stuff and flames and fires, and I could barely stay awake. I thought, what is that your overload? Everything is executed for you in some way that you don't have to engage your imagination at all. So
You know, I wondered, since Maeve had 30 years developing the arc of Vanessa, and I wondered, since Maeve clearly would have her own take on Vanessa, if you were her director at year 25 and had a different idea about Vanessa, how would it work between you? Or how does the director work it out with the actor to make it work for the audience then?
Well, I think we should probably take it out of the context of a soap, because the director on television is really just it functions entirely differently. It calls the shots, and there's very little. Why are you doing this? Any real commentary, meaningful commentary to the actor, which is one of the reasons why soaps are so free and so anarchic when they're good. But I think Diane and I could probably have an interesting conversation about communication between actors and directors in the theater and how that works. So I turn it over to you.
Well, I was thinking that because I think I've never worked on a soap opera, but my understanding would be there's a story, you know, and the director's there to serve the storyline that's been scripted. And again, I think, as Maeve's saying, it's about the shots, and you're not. But I was saying, what's the parallel? Okay, say you're an actor and you've been hired to play Gertrude in Hamlet. And Maeve says, well, you know, it comes with a real idea of how to play Gertrude and who her Gertrude is. I mean, first of all, that's what auditions are for, actually. I think the best use of an audition process as a director is you're meeting an actor, you're seeing what they can do, you see what they're bringing, then you're actually in a work process in an audition, kind of pushing them and seeing if you have a different take on something, if they're open to it. I mean, that's often what I'm looking for in an audition process. But in rehearsal, I always feel the job of the director is, you know, the director, it's interesting when you talked about the person reading the poem and the different levels. I always feel like when you start a project, the writer knows the most about the work. Then the next person is the director, because then the director has read it and digested it and thought about it and brought on scene designers and costume designers and had all these kind of ideas. And then at some point that does transfer to the actor, you know. So you come as a director with all that inspiration, all that thought, and your job is really to inspire everyone in the room and kind of spread your obsession and kind of light the fire of questions. I mean, I like to think about them as questions, less about this is what I think, you know, the answer is or what our production has to say, but rather what's the question? What's the interest? What's the question here that I'm investigating? And how can I get the actor to feel not like they're obediently acting out my desire, but rather I'm somehow looking for how I can get that actor interested. You know, I love it when I work with an actor when I'm working on something and I'm talking to them or phrasing questions or saying, how can we do that? And they go, I got it. Okay, watch. You know, and I just love that. I'll go sit down and they're going to show me. You know, that's what you want to get to. And then, to just complete my story, I think there comes a point where the actor knows the most about the role, you know, and it becomes the actor's knows. I mean, now when I go back to Hair on Broadway, it's been running a year, and I go every 6 weeks or so. I look at it to maintain it and take notes. And sometimes, you know, I definitely have notes where I think focus is off or rhythm or they're taking something too far and they have to be, you know, reined in or whatever. The joke as a director goes back to take out the improvements. You know, everybody's made improvements. But sometimes I do feel, it's kind of like your initial question, like how can I go and tell this actor who's been doing this, here I go off in my life. They've been doing this 8 times a week in, week out, 50 weeks in a row. Who am I to say what that moment is? I mean, they are so much more in relation to that moment, having played it and lived it, especially a show like Hair, which is so much about spontaneity and improvisation and being in the moment. So you're constantly navigating less, you know, how you want. I always think you never want to tell an actor how to do it. You want to give them, you know, you want to agree on what you're agreeing on. And that's always it. You know, we're going to make an agreement about what, because you have to set something. So you're making an agreement about what's important, what maybe the duration of something, but then there's always room, I believe, in the theater for it can change every night. I'm really a believer in that, because if it locks and it's just like, on a tape running, it's the death of the theater.
So again, Maeve and I were talking about Barton, who was a founder of the Royal Shakespeare Theatre, and he does master classes if he's still alive. But he did master classes, and I got to watch a clip of him teaching Patrick Stewart to do Titus. And it's the scene, it's 6 minutes, and it's the scene where Titus finds his daughter who's been mutilated, and he also has had a hand cut off, I think. And the first 3 minutes, Stewart does it saying every word, but kind of howling with rage. And then Barton, the director, says, and now with the words. And then there's another 3 minutes, and Stewart's kind of more peaceful, and he's despairing, but somehow bewildered as to how this has happened, and also filled with rage. And it was 3 words from the director, and the second 3 minutes it came to life. That's when it came to life. So I do want to tell you both a story, and then maybe you could talk about elements that do bring things to life for the audience, and we'll open it up to the audience. But this bridges child psychiatry and acting. And I realized in preparing for this that basically there are moments where I have theater occur in the office, and it's one-on-one. I'm the audience, and the patient, the child patient, is the performer, the set designer, the story maker, the writer. And I was called at one point by a family whose 8-year-old girl had had an injury and was scheduled to have surgery the next morning. And the parents called, and I'd never met these people before, and said the child was just in such despair, having panic, and they just didn't think the child could pull themselves together to get through the night. So I said, sure, come in, I'll see what I can do. And the child marched in with the parents. I could see how upset the child was. The child was drawn to my playhouse, the little dollhouse. She took out 3 dolls and put them to bed. And then as a psychiatrist, of course, I wanted to offer something. So I wanted to say, it's safe to sleep with mommy and daddy or something like that. But the child went on, and I said nothing. And the child screamed, and now they're coming. And so, again, I waited to see what would happen. And the child dragged all my dinosaurs out and slammed the family out of the bed. They bounced out of the bed, out of the house. They were in grave danger. It was dire. And again, I wanted to say something like, it seems like there's danger. But the child went on without me and said, and now he's coming. And she took one of my action heroes and got rid of the dinosaurs and brought the family back together. And then she looked at me and said, I think I've done it now. Can I go home? And she did. And I heard the next day everything had gone really well. The child did really well. And something had come to life for me and that child in that room. And it had little to do with me unless it was my company. The child had my company. Anyway, I wanted to share that with you because I think it was theater. I think it happened, and I think it happened there. And it was for a health purpose, but it doesn't matter. It was theater.
Get people to do some action, politically mostly, to continue with that, some sort of vitality they got out of the theater. Then when you talk about breaking the fourth wall, the celebration of that, the vitality, you seem to talk more about like aesthetics of theater rather than the action and how audience can participate in some kind of action. I like you to elaborate on a little bit more that aspect.
Sure. Yes, and I'm a huge fan of Brecht and his theories and ideas. and what I love about Brecht, actually, as a beginning statement to your question, is something you spoke about, Maeve, that was this idea that what Brecht always wanted from his actors, he called it the alienation effect. You know, he felt that actor, in which I'm not even going to suppose that I get it or that, you know, I could explain it to you truly, but what I take from it is the idea that you are in two realities at the same time, that you are in relation to yourself and you are relating to the audience, that I am a character in a play in the Caucasian chalk circle, but I'm also aware of you in the audience and I am speaking to you about society, politics, our condition, you know, what needs to change. So I think in many ways, certainly with Brecht, that breaking the fourth wall has been associated with a certain kind of political agenda or a didactic kind of agenda. I get interested in breaking the fourth wall for vitality. You use that word. And I actually, I think in our society right now, I think vitality is quite political, actually. I think of it politically. I think about it as giving ownership to an audience, that to say you are here, that you are alive, that you matter, and that even though it might not have a political agenda or a certain kind of politics to attach to it, to me that actually is very radical in a way, and actually very important. And maybe because I am in the field where I feel like that aspect of the contract with an audience member is not always fulfilled. And to me, it's at the heart of the theater. And I mean that, you know, just, you know, for me too. You know, when I go to the theater, if I go to a theater and I feel people are able to just fall asleep, you know, I always thinking about, speaking of doctors and medicine, I always tell my students, you know, the problem with the theater is you can really fail, whatever that means, and you really don't have a consequence. If you're a doctor and you're doing surgery, you know, there's a life at stake. You know, if you think about the operating theater as, you know, an operation table and that like this for this little girl, you know, there's something at stake there. So I'm always interested in ways to raise the stakes in the actual event. So I'll often, you know, say with my students, you know, you can't let the patient die on the operating table. We can't do that. But somehow in our medium, aesthetically or in a form, we can. And for me, where it often dies is in that lack of connection with an audience. I do a lot of opera, and one of the reasons why I actually like the opera is that I feel that in the opera, people boo more in the opera. I mean, have you ever been to a play in America and heard anyone boo? It just doesn't happen. You go to the opera, they actually boo. And I remember I was assisting André Serban, who I told you about earlier, in France when I was a graduate student. And he was doing Massenet's Thais, and the first act ended. And this guy in the fourth ring screams down. It's like an interlude, orchestral interlude. And someone from the fourth ring screams, "Metteur en scène aux toilettes," you know, which is director in the toilet. And then someone in the orchestra screams back, "Shut up, you don't know what you're talking about." And then they went on the argument, like in this beautiful Nice opera, gold opera house. And I was so excited. I went after the show, and the French stage manager was mortified. She said, "Oh, Diane, I'm so sorry. I'm so embarrassed. You know, it's horrible what goes on here." I was like, "It's fantastic. You know, people care enough about it." You know, and they're really looking. They're not only just immersing themselves into the world of Thais and Massenet, they're looking critically, which was what Brecht wanted. He wanted the audience to retain a level of criticism. That's what he wanted. He wanted them to be critically alive. That's why one of the Brecht's things was, it's so not in vogue now, so not in vogue, but he used to endorse smoking in the theater. He said audience spectators should be allowed to smoke because he felt smoking gave you like a level of detachment. You could never lose yourself aimlessly into a character, because smoking, you're somehow saying, do I like it, don't I like it? You know, your critical faculty is engaged somehow. Anyway.
Something Diane said just made me think about why there's never any catharsis in Brecht. That's not a possibility, because catharsis, I think, has to have, it operates with identification. You have to be able, the audience has to be able to identify with the tragic hero, heroine, no matter how exalted that character's circumstances are. And with the detachment, you never get to do that. There's always a pointing out that this is just fiction. It's not real.
But I just have to say, I mean, in the Greek theater, which was all catharsis,
Yes.
you know, that was also not real. I mean, those were masks. That was
Oh
music.
no,
you know.
I don't mean it in that sense. I mean identification, emotional identification.
Right, but we should
as
make
the
sure
basis
emotional
of that.
identification is not only with a certain kind of realism, right?
Yeah,
Like,
no, it
yeah.
doesn't. Not at all. Not at all. I didn't mean to imply that. I think that's an interesting direction that modern theater plays with. It's like deconstructing, and it's very fascinating, and it's rooted in where we are culturally, I think. But I think there is a deep human hunger. I don't think you can't go from one. You can't exclude anything, because there is this human hunger for learning through identification with others, I think. And I just wanted to go back to what Diane said about at the beginning, the playwright knows the most, then the director, then the actor. And then I would say that the audience teaches the actor a lot what the play is about. Because you have your rehearsal experience, and you work with your director, and you're kind of in that realm together. And then the audience comes in and brings other things that are valid and that might be slightly different from what you or the director or you together have thought of. So that's a whole nother cycle, I think.
Peter Brook used to always say, you know, when he'd get to when the performance was finally in front of an audience, he'd seen it in front of an audience, he'd go, now I can begin, you know, now I can understand what I should be doing, but not until then, yeah.
Why didn't you come up?
Congratulations on the success of Diane, of the Donkey Show and Sleep No More. And I did notice they were both really rich, sort of multi-sensory experiences that were sort of partly created by subordinating text. And I'm sort of being opinionated, but I think one of the things that really sort of turns me off about contemporary theater is so much of what's coming out of the new texts are just so mediocre. And I'm just wondering, what the ART plans to do as far as sort of encouraging really dynamic new texts. And I know that's particularly challenging in a subscription theater, I think probably too. And if there's other work out there that you're really hoping to produce.
It's interesting just to speak about, I don't know if people know the productions we're speaking of, but Sleep No More was a production by a group called Punch Drunk that took the text of Macbeth, the story, I shouldn't say text, the story of Macbeth, and they created a 44-room installation in a school in Brookline. It was the world of Macbeth. Did anyone see it here? I'm just curious. Oh, great, so people know what I'm talking about. And that was, as this gentleman said, there was really almost no text. So it was the play as a point of inspiration for the psyche, actually, of what that air would feel like. What would it feel like to be in the castle, you know, the night of the murder. And we just closed a production called Gats. I don't know if anyone saw that. That couldn't have been the more opposite. That was The Great Gatsby, Fitzgerald novel, all 7.5 hours of reading the entire novel out loud. Literally not one word cut. And it was set in a modern 1990s office where an office worker finds a copy of The Great Gatsby, picks it up and starts to read it out loud. And he does not stop, this actor, Scott Shepard, who's worked with Maeve. So it was interesting to me to have these two back to back, because in a way I felt Sleep No More was so much about image and sensory and a world completely without language. And the strength of the piece was in that weighting of the sensory and the imagery and the lack of words. And then you had Gats, was almost the opposite. It was all words. You know, it was not a production of The Great Gatsby where you saw Gatsby's estate and all that fabulous stuff that you associate with novel. It was this crappy old office with like files on the floor. It was all about the audience's imagination in relationship to hearing just words. So they couldn't have been more extreme. I just wanted to bring that up because we have had Sleep No More, which is so sensory and non-language based, and Gats, which is completely about a novel in its kind of most pure form. I think we're always looking in the theater for, I'm particularly interested in, the writers who are speaking to our times, who are talking about issues in our country and how we can have the theater be a place that deals with our current issues, and looking for writers who can capture that. And it is not easy. I think we live in a country actually where a lot of great writers, I hate to say it, don't stay working in the theater. This is just a syndrome. They tend to leave the theater because you just cannot make a living in the theater. And we don't have a culture where, to live and survive as just writing plays is a viable existence. So often the great, young, talented writers, even my colleagues from graduate school, they all are in Hollywood. Now that might be changing as the landscape there changes, but my interest, actually, to answer your question, is in cultivating a context for a writer. It's something also you spoke about, is how to look at someone's work over time, because a young writer is a young writer, and they need time. I mean, if anyone just saw one of Tennessee Williams' earliest plays, you might have said, "Forget it. What is this?" If he just had one shot, he would not be the Tennessee Williams we know today. So I'm interested in, as we cultivate writers, we have a festival coming now in the spring, the weekend of May 14th to 16th. It's called Emerging America. And it was my interest in how to support the emerging writer, the emerging actor, the emerging director, to create a context for new work, where an audience comes and sees something in development, sees it in the context of a festival. It's not judging something in a big old fancy production, but just understands that it's a voice that needs to be nurtured, and that maybe you'll develop a relationship to a writer and come back again to hear more work, and then see a production and get in a relationship with a voice, a new voice.
I guess I did wonder if you felt a certain amount of life had to be lived to be able to do certain roles. And for instance, I wondered what role you would like to play now if you had any choice, given your age and your life experience. And I wonder if you would agree. Or they always talk about King Lear and who can play Lear and who can play Othello. And I'm just wondering if anybody could. Drew Barrymore could. If she can conjure it up inside herself, then she can do it, right? Or not?
I've always thought it'd be interesting to have Juliet played by a 70-year-old. It'd be fascinating. Really.
Some of the hardest language, actually. That's the problem with Juliet, is
Yeah.
it's some of the hardest verse language. Yeah.
At this point, our children are grown, and I've been able to branch out. I enjoy doing things with my voice. I enjoy that a great deal at the moment. And I think it goes back to the theater being inside your head. Those are the boards I like to be on right now. I don't know. When I think about being on stage right now, it's very frightening to me. So that's interesting for me to think about why that is. But if somebody were to say, okay, you have one chance, I'd probably want to do Long Day's Journey into Night. Because it's such
That's scary.
It's very scary. Maybe that's why I'm scared. But that's what I would like to do. And it's not just the role. I hate that. I'm going to be the best whatever. Or I'm going to do this. That's a real turnoff at this point. But that's an ensemble play that is just, it's all about connection. So that's what I would like to do, I think. But I probably won't.
I was just going to say, since you talked about King Lear, just two stories. I mean, I think the problem with Shakespeare is, if you play one of those kings, you can't reduce it to yourself. That's what's hard. And maybe it takes a Laurence Olivier or someone of that stature to be able to really release to that. But I think that's the challenge of playing King Lear, is that you're it's not just you. It can't be. You're in relation to something greater than yourself. Having said that, I did do King Lear as my graduate thesis production at Columbia, and I did it with actors that were all, graduate school age, and it was really a terrible production of King Lear. I have to say, I think I was really lost in the minutia of like, oh, we're at a lab and we're learning acting, and it was, as a production, it was really quite terrible. But I had done the summer before, I was in Wisconsin working with children, and I ran like again, theater games, Viola Spolin for kids. And I was there with my now husband, Randy, and we said, what are we going to do? Let's do story theater. Let's pick, and we said, let's do King Lear. I'm not kidding you. We said, that's going to be funny. These kids, it was like kids from 6 to like 14. Said, like, what are you doing in camp, sweetie? We're like, well, we're doing King Lear. And I swear, that production of King Lear, which we didn't do the whole play, we did a story theater version. We used the Lamb Shakespeare stories, and we did it as story theater. That was by far the better production of King Lear, the better story. It was more moving. I'm not sure people felt catharsis, but when the 8-year-old boy played King Lear, it was stunning. And all the little girls wanted to be Cordelia. They all wanted to be hung. They're like, I want to do the hangings. I mean, the way they were relating to that story was so powerful and so pure and so simple. It was striking to me that we could tell that story, through young people.
I have a question. In Diane's opening remarks, she talked about moving the needle on etiquette in theater in new productions, and I'm curious about your thoughts on where do you find the new level in these productions? Do people go over the line? Will there be multiple Yankees sucks chants at the Red Sox musical? And
I can't wait for that. That would be great. Then we'd done the show right. No, yes. That's an interesting question. And I think, truly, I feel like we're so far from that, that, gosh, bring that on and let's deal with that problem when it happens. Although there is, the only thing I can say is because you get like, there's these bursts of activity in newspapers and on the web about, people eating at the theater. I don't know if you track that. That might just be in the theater circles, but when Patti LuPone was recently on Broadway and someone was eating popcorn or something, she went crazy and she stopped the performance. She just could not tolerate that behavior. Because that's when you work at a theater, typically it comes down to, you let them bring their coffee in the theater or not. That's kind of where the conversation goes. Can they eat in the theater or not? And I tend to be on the side of the spectrum, like let them, in London, everybody has ice cream in the intermissions. Why can't we eat as part of what it means to come out and be alive and talking, and it's part of our human existence. And I'm just interested in that. But I think the answer is every show has its proper relationship to the audience. So, sure, when Johnny Baseball comes in the spring and, you're sitting in the audience and there, the fans are screaming and it's the 10th inning of that game in 2004. And as a director, I'm making you feel like you're here and you're allowed to get up and scream. I hope I can release an audience to feel that they're allowed to participate. Would that behavior be appropriate at Long Day's Journey into Night with Maeve in it? No. We don't want you screaming. We don't want you booing. Every show should have its own set of rules. And my issue is that we kind of take one set of rules and apply it to everything. And that's where I take issue. It's very true. It's very true. And that is a technique to break the audience's behavior.
I've been an ART attender probably for 30 years, and I was so happy to go over to Brookline and see your show, Sleep No More. And I wandered through that building. I didn't really understand that I was supposed to chase after the actors. So I wandered through the rooms there, and I had a wonderful experience of having a theater that is very different, that you had some very intimate and very individual experiences. And so my question is, now that you've kind of moved away from this theater, from this location to another one, and you also moved into the box on Arrow Street, can you give us a little bit of a vision of how could you imagine to take the theater even into a public space, into a public realm? I remember a production of Orlando Furioso in Switzerland, and I feel there's so many other possibilities out there of moving out of the theater and of this just looking at each other, of interacting. And we have such wonderful public spaces here in Cambridge, in Boston.
Yes.
Can you give us some of your visions for that?
Sure. No, I'm so happy to hear your comment. I am so interested in that, the public space as a theater. And when you said, do we need costumes? I thought there's a great YouTube viral thing that's going around. I don't know if anybody's seen it. I think it's called like Mercado Opera. Has anyone seen this? It's opera in the marketplace. And it's these people in like a market square. I don't even know what, it must be Spain or... It's in Valencia. So it's one of those public markets, where like the vegetables and the meat, and it's kind of in this covered warehouse, and everybody's moving and got their shopping carts, and all of a sudden, one of the shopkeepers, a plant, starts singing opera. And then this other person's walking, just with their cart, costume, they start singing opera, and spontaneously, all these people start singing opera, and everybody stops, and they watch, and it's like the spontaneous moment of theater in a complete public space. So I love that idea. And when you ask, where is it, where you blur the line and it's no longer theater, one could say, is that theater? What is theater? If John Cage used to say, all theater needs is kind of like a frame. I can sit on a park bench and just look at life in front of me, and that's theater. All I have to do is kind of just put a frame on it, and then it's theater. He was the one who was so radical in saying, every sound, a dog barking in a house, is as much the composition as my orchestration or my notes in a piece. So I'm absolutely excited about using public space. I've been very interested in the Charles River and what we could do there. I'm actually really interested in Castle Island and the islands, because I feel like they're a part of the life and the natural landscape here. I haven't been there yet. When I come in on the shuttle, I look at them, and I've heard about them, and I know on Halloween there's a big day where everybody goes to Castle Island, but I have this like inchoate vision of doing something on Castle Island, that people take a ferry to, because I just like that idea of, you have to make a journey, and there's something about the journey and something grand that, roams on the islands or something. But I actually had a meeting with the head of the Peabody Museum, who is a museum here on the Harvard campus, and he was so great. He said, I want to show you all the rooms. You could make something, with the Aztecs on that floor. And he said, I'll even take you in the warehouses, where the art is stored. And then he hadn't seen Sleep No More. And then he wrote me after Sleep. He's like, but you can't, I'll have to have some guards. You can't go touching everything, because, in Sleep No More, everybody touches everything. And, in this museum, it's, ancient, like Aztec art from, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years ago. But what I get interested in alternative space is just how it wakes up the event and the other kind of audience you can find as a result, too. People who maybe are not even thinking they're going to the theater that happen to come alive and be present, because I think that's those things that are like that opera thing in the market. It's just so much about how can we become present? How can we, our lives that are so driven in this day and age of running, BlackBerry. I walk in the street like this in New York with my BlackBerry. It's horrible. You're just constantly going, how can we just stop and be present and see each other?
Well, I have enjoyed this presentation immensely, but as you were both all talking, I was wondering whether in your efforts to get the audience to participate more and to sort of be present, is there the chance that that experience that Maeve talked about as learning by identifying with somebody in a narrative or comparing notes with somebody in a good story, could that be lost because there's so many interesting gimmicks that get the audience on their feet? And do you worry about that, and do you feel kind of that you're wedded to the participatory audience because of that mission of the Lobe that we've watched for 30, 35 years, where sometimes plays that we all long to see in a more classic way were done in a most peculiar way. And sometimes that's great, and sometimes it's really not. You just long for the good old play.
Yep.
And so I want to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. I think it's funny. It's hard because, the donkey show's running, and certainly that's a certain kind of participation. I have to say, because I get, talked about a lot as like, oh yeah, audience participation or interactive theater. And actually, I really don't like those words, especially interactive theater. Like for me, if someone said, oh, you want to go to this interactive theater event, I'd be like, no, please. Because in a way, what I hate about it is that, when someone feels like they're forcing you to do something, because there's nothing we resist more than like a forced emotional reaction, thinking about psychology, when you want to, So for me, when I think about things like The Donkey Show or Sleep No More, actually what I'm interested about both of them, very different, because Sleep No More was absolutely almost, even though as it got more and more popular and people were like running the halls and you saw a lot of people, in a way it was intended as a very private experience. It was very much about private. Donkey Show is absolutely about communal celebration, and it's that way because it's 1970s and it's an idea about the forest, the Athenian magical forest where transgressive things can happen, and how can we make that alive? So that's the purpose of that. But in both, it's about freedom. When I think about just participation for the audience, I actually I long for a sense of freedom for the audience. That's what really interests me. That an audience can be free to engage physically, vocally, or be a wallflower. I mean, that's very important to me at the Donkey Show. If you want to stand on the wall and just watch the whole thing, that's why I love Studio 54. Vladimir Horowitz, the famous concert pianist, loved to go to Studio 54, but he was never on the dance floor. He was in the balcony. He just loved to go and people watch, So that was always my thing with Donkey Show. It's not about you have to dance. No, you can watch. So I just wanted to say that I'm interested in freedom for the audience, less about, a kind of revelry. Although, certain of the shows I am involved in right now, I think, Hair on Broadway, everybody's dancing on the stage at the end. In the Donkey Show, they're all dancing. One might say, okay, she likes just people to be dancing all the time. But I actually, what I crave in the theater is, and I think we all hope this, I really believe that theater does serve a human need. We have to ask this as artists, what's if I as a producer, I have to convince people to give us money and, for support us, so why, with all the other problems, why? And I do think theater serves a human need. And it serves a human need in many ways. And to me, I'm always looking for a theatrical event. The greatest theatrical events are the ones that kind of touch all of them. And that includes a need for ritual, a need for a group of people to pass through something together, a need actually for spectacle. And I always think about spectacle as something that's larger than yourself. That's what we really like about spectacle when spectacle works. It's why we love to go to look at a mountain or stand on the edge of an ocean, or a great cathedral, because you feel humbled and awed in the sense of something bigger than yourself. A human need to learn, and that's why we love to go to the theater. A human need for empathy, to talk about empathy, which we talked about earlier. So actually, it's not about the theater is about participation. It's about what can the ultimate theatrical event satisfy, and some are weighted in different areas, but certainly. What you were saying about narrative and empathy, it's just different ways at that. When we're talking about catharsis, because again, we don't really know what happened in 5th century Athens, but we look at scholars and pictures and whatever is not even pictures, just drawings. And how was I empathizing? With it was completely theatricalized, or say Shakespeare's plays, completely theatricalized. Those are all men. Talk about casting. Those are all men playing those parts. It's a young boy playing Juliet. You are absolutely aware this is not realism. It is theater. So I always get interested in that level of theatricality. I am very dedicated to theatricality because it can be done in film. I say do it in film. What is the theater? And that does include, for me, story and a kind of empathy and identification.
So we have to come to a close, but I had two last questions for both of you, or each of you individually. In Sleep No More, I actually tried to make eye contact with the actors, and when the woman was agitated and washing her hands, I decided to see if I could look her in the eye, you know, do my job as a psychiatrist. But anyway, it looked blank. Her look was blank. So in some way I was there but not there. Was that meant?
That was very specific.
Okay.
Actually, the actors who were the characters in Macbeth do not see the audience. But there were the witches and the characters, if you could recognize them from the Hitchcock Rebecca film, like Mrs. Danvers, they looked you in the eye.
Okay.
So it was very deliberate on the part of the director and the company of who could transgress and see the audience and who could not.
Okay. And then I've just been curious since we met as to why you wanted to keep your hair gray. Why did you fight the battle to keep gray hair?
Oh,
See, I didn't know if Vanessa, if it was, that's what she should have looked like, or if it was that you were graying, so you had to be you.
it was because the character was involved in a storyline where she had, she was married to a man who was 20 years her junior. And I was also sick and tired of dyeing my hair. And I also was angry at the thought that there was such constraint that if the show had sort of embraced this, for them, controversial storyline, then would they put their money where their mouth was and let me go gray? And it's interesting what happened. I finally wore the producer down. He just looked at me at one point and he said, "I guess you want to be old." I thought you're kind of missing the point here. But I did go gray, and then the story, which was very important to a lot of the fans, some of the women got very angry with me and wrote me things like, "What, do you want us to think you're his mother?" So it was an interesting experience to see the degree to which people could enter a story, but they had to have it be pretty. In other words, they could receive perhaps an uncomfortable truth that people might have relationships that might be slightly transgressive, but it had to be prettied up. And that may be the medium, that may be the television, it may be the soaps, or it relates to some things that Diane was saying about boundaries and how you mix the real and the unreal. So that's a long and short answer.
Okay. So thank you, Diane. Thank you, Maeve, for being here. Thank you all for coming.